The dark beginning. The cold, alien sky stretched endlessly above her as she lay on the rough, rocky ground. Her name was Kira, and she had once been part of a team sent to explore this distant world. But now she was alone. The humans who had promised to protect her had abandoned her, leaving her to die on a planet filled with dangers no one could have imagined. The air was thick with an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional rumble of distant thunder. Kira could feel the weight of the planet pressing down on her, its vast emptiness surrounding her. The harsh winds whipped through her tangled hair, and every breath she took burned her lungs. She could barely move, her body battered and weak, from days of hunger, dehydration, and exhaustion. But even in her pain, something inside her refused to give up. She wasn't just going to die here, not like this. She forced herself to stand, gripping a jagged rock for support. Her legs trembled beneath her and her vision blurred. She didn't know how much longer she could last, but she couldn't afford to stop. In the distance, she saw movement, large shadows darting through the mist. Kira froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew exactly what those shadows were: monsters. They were the reason her team had abandoned her, the reason she was here alone. On this deadly planet, the creatures ruled the land. Massive, terrifying beasts with sharp claws, glowing eyes, and a hunger that never seemed to end. They hunted in packs, tearing apart anything that crossed their path. And now, Kira was their prey. But as she watched the shadows grow closer, something strange happened. Her body, despite its weakness, felt a surge of energy, a strange, primal pull deep within her. It was as if the planet itself was calling to her. She took a hesitant step forward, then another, and another, until she was standing tall and steady. Kira had no idea where this strength was coming from. She had never felt anything like it before. But in that moment, she knew she had to try. The monsters were closing in and she couldn't run anymore. She was either going to die or she was going to survive. As the first creature emerged from the mist, Kira's pulse quickened. It was huge, at least 3 times the size of a man, with muscular limbs and a mouth full of sharp, jagged teeth. Its glowing eyes locked onto her, and it took a step forward. She could see the hunger in its gaze. But instead of fear, Kira felt something else, an odd calm. She stood her ground, staring into the creature's eyes. The beast growled, but instead of attacking, it stopped. It looked at her, its head tilting slightly as if confused. Kira's heart raced, but she didn't move. She didn't run. Something in her told her that running was the last thing she should do. The creature growled again, its teeth bared, but it didn't lunge. Instead, it stepped back, slowly, cautiously. And then, to Kira's shock, it turned and disappeared back into the mist, leaving her standing there untouched. Kira's breath came in ragged gasps as she processed what had just happened. She should have been dead, but she wasn't. Somehow, against all odds, she was still alive. And in that moment, she realized something. The monsters weren't just mindless beasts. They were something more. And maybe, just maybe, she could learn to control them. Her survival had just begun. Survival of the fittest. Kira's body ached, her muscles screaming in protest with each step she took. The heat of the alien sun burned down on her, but she couldn't stop. There was no time to rest. If she was to survive on this planet, she needed to keep moving, to keep thinking. She had no food, no water, and no way to signal for help. The radio in her pack had long since stopped working, and her team, well, they weren't coming back. The betrayal stung, but it wasn't the first time she had been left behind. She had survived worse. As she trudged forward, her eyes scanned the landscape, trying to make sense of the terrain. The planet was hostile. Its ground was a mix of jagged rocks and treacherous ravines. The air was thick and humid, making every breath feel like she was suffocating. But Kira didn't focus on the pain. She focused on survival. The monsters were still out there, lurking in the shadows. She knew they were watching her. Their presence was felt like a dark cloud hovering above her. But now Kira wasn't afraid. The creatures had spared her once. Perhaps they sensed something in her, something different, but she couldn't trust them completely. She stumbled upon a small cave hidden beneath a cluster of twisted trees. Her eyes darted around, assessing the safety of the place. It wasn't much, but it was shelter, and for now that was all she needed. Kira dropped to her knees, her body finally giving in to exhaustion. She didn't have the strength to keep going, not yet. But even as her mind began to fog with weariness, her senses remained alert. She could hear something moving in the distance, an eerie sound, like the scraping of claws against stone. Her heart skipped a beat. The creatures were closer than she thought, and this time, she wasn't sure she could outrun them. She reached for a jagged rock nearby, clutching it tightly. She didn't know how she was going to survive, but one thing was certain. She wasn't going down without a fight. But then, just as quickly as the sound had come, it stopped. The silence that followed was thick, oppressive, and unnerving. Kira's eyes narrowed, straining to hear any hint of movement, but all she could hear was the pounding of her own heart. Suddenly, the ground trembled beneath her. A low growl echoed through the cave, so deep and resonant that it seemed to vibrate the very air. Kira's breath caught in her throat. The growl came again, this time louder, closer. And then, out of the darkness, two glowing eyes appeared, staring right at her. Her instincts kicked in, but instead of fear, she felt something else: curiosity. The creature was huge, easily 3 times her size, with rippling muscles and scales that glistened in the dim light. But it wasn't charging her. No, it was watching her, studying her. Kira's mind raced. She could feel something different about this encounter. The creature wasn't just another mindless predator. It was intelligent, like it was waiting for her to make a move. And then, for the first time since her arrival on this planet, Kira spoke. "What do you want?" The creature didn't answer, of course. But in that moment, Kira felt a strange connection. It wasn't the kind of bond one would have with an animal. No, this was something deeper. She could feel its emotions, its thoughts swirling around her. The creature stepped forward, its massive form blocking the entrance to the cave. Kira's heart raced, but instead of running, she stood still, waiting. And then, as if on cue, the creature bowed its head, slowly, cautiously, as if it was acknowledging her presence. Kira blinked, unsure of what was happening. The creature wasn't attacking her. It wasn't even threatening her. It was simply waiting. For a moment, she considered running, but then a thought crossed her mind. What if I could control it? The monsters had spared her once, but could she make them obey her? The struggle for survival had just taken a new turn, and Kira wasn't sure what the answer would be. But one thing was clear. Her fight for survival had just turned into something much bigger, something that could change everything. The discovery of power. The days bled into one another as Kira continued her solitary existence on the planet. She had found a rhythm of survival, learning to adapt to the harsh environment. The monstrous creatures still prowled the planet, but Kira had grown accustomed to their presence. More importantly, she had learned something about herself. Something she hadn't fully understood until now. The connection she had with the creatures was undeniable. It wasn't just instinct, it was something deeper. Each time one of them crossed her path, she felt a strange energy coursing through her. A pull, a connection, that made her wonder if she was somehow different. But it wasn't until she encountered one of them again, this time alone, that the true nature of her power began to reveal itself. She had ventured out in search of water, a task that had become increasingly difficult as the days wore on. Her body was still weak, but her resolve was stronger than ever. She stumbled across a shallow stream, its murky waters running through jagged rocks and bent to drink. As she cupped the water in her hands, a low growl reached her ears. She froze, the unmistakable sound of one of the monsters. Her heart raced as she slowly rose to her feet, scanning the area for the creature. The growl came again, closer this time. Her breath caught in her throat. She didn't have a weapon. She didn't have the strength to run. She was cornered. But as the creature stepped into the clearing, Kira didn't run. Instead, she stood tall, She stared at it, waiting for its next move. The creature, huge and hulking with dark, leathery skin, paused, its glowing eyes locking onto hers. For a moment, Kira felt a sharp tug at the back of her mind, like something was pulling her attention inward. She couldn't explain it, but it was as if the creature was speaking to her, without words, without sound. It was communication of some kind, raw, primal, but undeniably real. The growl faded into silence. Kira felt an instinctive urge to raise her hand, as if reaching out to the beast, and she did. Her fingers trembled, not from fear, but from an unknown energy building inside her. The moment her hand was raised, something happened. The creature stopped moving, its eyes widening slightly as if it had never seen anything like this before. Kira's mind spun. What was this? How was she doing this? She didn't have time to question it. Her heart beat loudly in her ears as she willed the creature to obey her. "Stop," she whispered, her voice shaking. It wasn't a command, not really, just a thought, a wish, an instinct. And then, to her astonishment, the creature obeyed. It took a step back, slowly, cautiously, as if unsure whether it should attack or retreat. Kira's pulse quickened, but she held her ground. She focused on the creature, her thoughts becoming clearer, sharper. "Obey me. Listen." The creature's muscles tensed as it seemed to struggle against her pull. Then, as if giving in, it stepped back again, moving away from her with slow, deliberate steps. Kira could feel the power she was holding in her mind pressing down on the creature. It wasn't fear she was controlling, but something else, something raw and primal. It was respect. It was dominance. It was control. For the first time, Kira understood what she had done. She had commanded it. The realization hit her like a storm. This wasn't just a survival instinct. This wasn't just a lucky coincidence. She had tapped into something far greater, something that allowed her to control the very creatures that had once hunted her. Her heart raced with the possibilities. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She wasn't just a woman left to die. She was becoming something else, something far more dangerous. Kira stared after the retreating monster, her mind buzzing with thoughts. What could she do with this power? Would she be able to command an army of these creatures to use them for her own purpose? Or would she lose control and become the very thing she feared? The next chapter of her survival had begun, and she had just unlocked a power she could barely begin to understand. The unseen enemy, Kira's newfound power, simmered beneath the surface as she spent the next few days testing the limits of her connection with the creatures. Every encounter was a delicate dance. One moment she could feel their wild instincts pushing against her influence, and the next she could feel their obedience like an invisible thread between them. She was learning how to hold their attention, how to push and pull their movements with nothing but her will. But there was a deeper, more unsettling realization creeping into her mind. Despite her growing control over the monsters, the planet itself still seemed to pulse with an unseen threat. Something was not right. One evening, as Kira sat near the edge of a cliff overlooking a vast, barren expanse, the faint hum of an engine reached her ears. It was a sound she hadn't heard in days, human-made, mechanical. Her pulse quickened as she strained her eyes, scanning the horizon. The stars above were dim, but the faint glimmer of a ship's lights flickered in the distance. Her heart sank. They're back, the humans, her team, the very ones who had left her to die. Kira's mind raced. She had no idea why they had returned, but she knew one thing. They weren't coming back to rescue her. They were coming to finish what they had started. She had no place in their plans now, not after the betrayal. And then something else occurred, to her. Something darker. She wasn't the only one who had changed. The humans who had abandoned her. What if they had been altered too? What if they had been changed by the planet in the same way she had? Kira's heart pounded in her chest as the full weight of her realization hit her. The monsters weren't the only enemies she had to face. The humans, her own kind, might now be just as dangerous. But they had a greater advantage. They had technology, weapons, and the authority to control. They were the ones who made the rules. But not anymore. Kira clenched her fists. She didn't know if she was ready for this confrontation, but she knew one thing. She had no choice. The hum of the ship grew louder, now unmistakable. Kira's thoughts went into overdrive. She could try to escape, to hide and let them pass, but she knew the humans wouldn't give up. They would hunt her down. They would capture her and make sure she never saw the light of day again. She needed to think. She needed to act fast. In that moment of stillness, Kira closed her eyes and reached deep inside herself. She felt the connection to the monsters, a bond she had been cultivating over days of silence and observation. Her thoughts reached out, brushing against their minds. She could feel them, the pack, the creatures she had commanded before. They were waiting for her call. But Kira knew that they couldn't just fight on instinct anymore. They would need her guidance. They would need to be ready for war. The ship was drawing closer, and her time was running out. Kira's voice broke the stillness, quiet but firm, a command that rang clear in her mind. Gather, protect. She opened her eyes, and in that instant she could hear them. Heavy steps, the rustle of claws on rocks, the growls and low roars of the monsters as they moved in response to her call. They were coming. Kira didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know if her power was strong enough to stand against the humans. She didn't know if the monsters would follow her lead into battle, or if they would turn on her. But she had no choice. She couldn't run. She couldn't hide. The war was here, and this time it wasn't just her survival on the line, it was the very future of the planet. Command of the beasts. The sky above Kira burned with the fading light of the sun, casting long, jagged shadows across the alien terrain. But there was no time to admire the beauty of the landscape. The looming battle was close now, and the weight of responsibility pressed heavily on her shoulders. She had summoned the monsters, her army, and they were ready. The creatures, once mindless predators, now moved as one, driven by the silent connection she had forged with them. It was no longer just survival. It was war. Kira stood at the edge of the makeshift battlefield, her breath steady despite the storm raging in her mind. The human ship was nearing, its engines thrumming as it sliced through the atmosphere above. She couldn't shake the feeling that the humans were somehow different now, that they, too, had been changed by the planet's dark influence. But there was no time to dwell on that. She had made her choice. The monsters would follow her commands, either to victory or to their doom. As she watched the creatures move into position, she felt their presence in her mind, their growls, their shifting. Wait. They were aware of her every thought, every emotion. They were waiting, sensing her next move. And Kira had learned something vital in this time of command. Her control over them was not just about power, it was about understanding. The creatures weren't just wild beasts anymore. They were soldiers, each with its own unique strength, each with a role to play in this war. Some were massive, their claws capable of tearing through the toughest armor. Others were quick, stealthy, and deadly in the shadows. Kira had learned to use each creature's abilities to her advantage, matching them with tasks that suited their natural instincts. Together they formed an unstoppable force, and for the first time since she had been abandoned on this God-forsaken planet, Kira felt like she had a purpose again. She closed her eyes and raised her hand, feeling the familiar surge of power build inside her. The monsters reacted at once, shifting into formation. The ground beneath her feet seemed to hum with the vibrations of their movement. She could feel their readiness, their loyalty, and for a brief moment, Kira was overwhelmed by a strange sense of unity, a bond that went deeper than survival. But that moment was fleeting, shattered by the sound of approaching engines. The humans had arrived. Kira's eyes snapped open as the first of the human soldiers descended from the ship, their figures casting long shadows in the dim light. The soldiers were heavily armed, their weapons gleaming in the fading sunlight. But Kira didn't flinch. She wasn't afraid. She had an army of her own now. and she would not let them take this planet, her home, without a fight. With a sharp motion, Kira raised both hands, her fingers splayed wide. She didn't need to speak the words. The creatures felt her command and they moved. The ground shook with the sound of massive claws scraping against rock as the first wave of monsters lunged toward the soldiers. The humans fired, their weapons, lighting up the dusk sky, but the monsters were relentless. They moved faster than Kira had ever seen, their savage instincts unleashed with deadly precision. Some soldiers tried to hold their ground, firing into the horde, but it was clear they were outmatched. Kira watched the battle unfold with a strange detachment, her heart pounding, her mind focused entirely on the creatures. Her control over them was absolute, and she could feel the ebb and flow of their movements like a storm in her chest. She willed them to attack, to retreat, to flank the enemy. Each monster obeyed with stunning coordination, as if they were one entity, not many. But the humans weren't backing down. Kira could see their desperation, the way they fought to regroup and retaliate. Their technology, their weapons, they were powerful, but they lacked the primal strength Kira had now unlocked within herself and the monsters. The tide of battle shifted, the human soldiers falling back, some retreating to their ship, others caught in the chaos of the fight. Kira could sense their fear. It was the same fear they had once seen in her. But now it was them who were running. Kira took a step forward, her eyes scanning the battlefield. The monsters were winning, but the fight wasn't over yet. She knew this was just the beginning. She had commanded them to fight, but now she had to make a choice. Did she let the monsters finish the job? Or was there a chance to save the humans? Her heart hardened. The choice was clear. She would not let them take this world, not again. She raised her hand, her voice low but firm. Finish it! With her command, the monsters surged forward, overwhelming the last of the human resistance. The air was thick with the sounds of battle, roars, gunfire, and the screech of metal being torn apart. But through it all, Kira remained still, watching, guiding, commanding. The battle was won. But as the dust settled, a new thought emerged in Kira's mind. The monsters had obeyed her. But what about the humans? How much longer would they continue to push her, to challenge her? And as the last of the human soldiers retreated, Kira realized that this was no longer just a fight for survival. This was a fight for dominance. The world was hers now, and she would not be threatened again. The betrayal. The planet, once silent and empty, was now alive with the sounds of war. Kira's army of monsters stood victorious on the blood-soaked ground, their growls echoing in the air as the remnants of the human forces retreated into the distant horizon. For a moment, there was peace, a strange, unsettling calm as Kira surveyed the battlefield. She had achieved the unthinkable. She had taken control of the monsters, and with them she had driven the invaders away. But something in her gut twisted. The victory felt hollow. Something wasn't right. It had to be the calm before the storm. Kira stood alone at the edge of the battlefield, watching the remaining monsters scatter into the shadows, their movements swift and silent. She felt a fleeting connection to them, the invisible bond that had grown stronger over time. But even as she felt that power surge within her, there was an unsettling emptiness, a sense of growing doubt. She turned toward the makeshift camp she had set up, the flickering firelight casting long shadows across the rough terrain. Her heart pounded as she walked back, the weight of her thoughts heavy on her mind. She was stronger than ever before, but in that strength there was a darkness, an unsettling pull toward something she couldn't name. And for the first time she wondered, am I in control of this power, or is it controlling me? As Kira approached the camp, she saw him. Captain Raiden, one of the few humans who had survived the battle, standing near the fire, his hands bound with coarse rope. His face was bruised, his eyes cold with defiance. Kira's heart skipped a beat. Raiden had been one of the soldiers she had once trusted, one of the few who had fought alongside her before the betrayal. But now, he was nothing more than a prisoner. You should have stayed in the shadows, Raiden, Kira said quietly, her voice laced with a chilling calm. He lifted his head, meeting her gaze with a steely look. You've lost yourself, Kira. You're becoming the very thing you feared. The monsters. They're not your allies. They're your chains. His words struck Kira harder than she cared to admit. She could feel her anger rising, a primal surge coursing through her. But she tamped it down. She couldn't let him see her weakness, not now, not after everything she had done. Raiden spat blood onto the ground at her feet. You think you're in control? You think these beasts follow you out of loyalty? They follow because you've shown them fear. You're their leader only because you command them with fear. But what happens when they stop obeying? What happens when you can no longer control them? Kira's breath caught in her throat. She knew the truth of what he was saying, but hearing it aloud made it all the more real. She had forced the monsters to obey her, had bent them to her will through sheer power. But was that power truly hers? Or was she merely a puppet, playing a dangerous game she couldn't control? You're wrong, Kira said, her voice steady, though the doubt gnawed at her insides. They listen because I am strong, and that is all that matters. Raiden's eyes softened, a flicker of pity crossing his face. Strength isn't the only thing that matters, Kira. You've become what you hated most, and when the time comes, those creatures will turn on you. They will betray you just as I have. The words hit Kira like a physical blow. Betrayal. The word burned in her mind. She had betrayed herself, had turned away from everything she once believed in. But could she really trust the creatures she commanded? Could she really trust the power that had granted her victory? Raiden continued, his voice low and filled with venom. You think this world is yours now? You think the monsters will protect you when they realize you've become just like the humans who left you here to die? They're just waiting for the right moment to strike, and when they do, you won't even see it coming. Kira's heart pounded in her chest. The monster within her began to stir, its claws scraping against her mind. But she could feel something else, something even darker, a cold, creeping realization. What if he's right? She turned away from Raiden, her mind racing. She had pushed him away once, believing that the humans were the true enemy. But now she wasn't so sure. What if the real enemy wasn't the humans? What if the betrayal was already happening, right in front of her eyes? Kira stepped into the camp, her mind a whirlwind of doubt and fear. As she did, she caught a glimpse of movement in the shadows. Her heart froze. The creatures that had once obeyed her, that had followed her every command, they were moving, but not in the way they had before. Their eyes, glowing with an unsettling light, were focused on her. And as Kira looked closer, she saw it. Their expressions were no longer those of mindless beasts. They were watching her, waiting, as if they understood something she didn't. The betrayal had already begun. The final command. The full moon cast an eerie glow across the battlefield, painting the twisted landscape in silver and shadow. Kira stood alone, the weight of everything she had become pressing down on her chest. The creatures she once commanded were now scattered across the barren land, watching her from the darkness. Her power had been her strength, her weapon, but it had come at a cost. The monsters no longer obeyed her as they once had. They no longer feared her. Kira's mind raced, replaying Raiden's words, echoing like a haunting refrain in her ears. When they realize you've become just like the humans, they will turn on you. And when they do, you won't even see it coming. She had been betrayed by her own people, left to die on this planet. And now she stood on the precipice of losing everything she had fought for. The monsters, the power, the world she had taken. But worse than that, she had lost herself. She had become the very thing she once despised, a conqueror, a leader who ruled through fear. She had lost her humanity along the way. The wind howled, its icy fingers tugging at her cloak, and for the first time in a long while, Kira felt truly alone. She had built an empire on the backs of the creatures who had once been her enemies, but now they were more like her captors, waiting for the right moment to strike. She could feel their eyes on her piercing through the shadows, and though she could still sense their loyalty, it was different now. The bond between them had shifted. It wasn't about survival anymore. It was about control, and the creatures were no longer willing to be controlled. In the distance, she saw the faint outline of the human ship, hovering just beyond the horizon. They were regrouping, preparing for another assault. Raiden was right. The humans were coming back. But this time, it wasn't just about survival. It was about reclaiming what they had lost. Kira's thoughts turned inward. Was there a way out of this? Could she find a way to end the cycle of betrayal, both hers and the creatures? Or was she destined to become a tyrant, crushed under the weight of her own power? She closed her eyes, reaching out with her mind, calling to the monsters once more. This time it wasn't just a command, it was a plea. She wasn't the woman who had led them into battle anymore. She wasn't the woman who had wielded power with ruthless precision. She was someone else now, someone who had made mistakes, but someone who wanted to make it right. Please, she thought, her heart heavy. Please, let me lead you differently. Let me be something better. For a long moment, nothing happened. The creatures remained still, their glowing eyes fixed on her from the shadows, silent and unmoving. But then, as if hearing her unspoken plea, one of them stepped forward. A massive beast, its thick, scaly skin gleaming in the moonlight, approached her slowly. It was the same one she had first encountered, the one she had controlled with nothing but her will. The creature stopped before her, its gaze unwavering, and Kira could feel the weight of its presence deep within her bones. It was no longer a mindless predator. It was something more, something that had become her equal. And in that moment, Kira realized the truth. She wasn't meant to control them. She was meant to understand them, to coexist with them. She lowered her head, a silent acknowledgement of her own growth. She had been wrong. Control was never the answer. Leadership, true leadership, was about trust. It was about forging a bond of mutual respect, not domination. The creature bowed its head in a gesture of respect, and Kira felt the bond between them shift once again. It wasn't a bond built on fear. It was built on something deeper, something more profound. Understanding. And in that moment, Kira knew that she had a choice. She could keep fighting for dominance, keep leading through fear, or she could make a new path, one that embraced the creatures as equals, one that brought true unity, not just between the monsters and herself, but between herself and the humans who had come to reclaim the planet. With a deep breath, Kira turned toward the human ship on the horizon. The battle wasn't over, but this time, it wouldn't be won through fear and control. It would be won through understanding, through the power of cooperation. She raised her hand not in command but in invitation. The monsters, one by one, stepped forward, surrounding her, their presence a testament to the bond they had forged, together. Kira wasn't just the leader of the monsters anymore. She was the leader of a new world. A world where understanding triumphed over control, and where strength came not from fear, but from unity. As the first human soldiers descended from their ship, Kira stood tall, ready to face them. She wasn't the same woman who had been abandoned here so long ago. She was stronger, wiser, and ready to lead. Not through domination, but through respect. The final command wasn't one of power, it was one of unity. And as she stood there, facing the future, Kira knew that this was only the beginning of a new chapter for the planet, for herself, and for the creatures that had once been her enemies.